Good morning, everyone. We'll give it a go again, and thanks for your tolerance. Uh, this is actually a webinar for South Australia, so we will rectify that when we send out the slides. I hope everyone has got the requisite coffee or tea or whatever else is that they do when they wake up. I certainly have had a few coffees, and I hope you're all well. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the country in which I'm coming to you from today, the land of the Ngunnawal people. I live just outside of Canberra on the border with New South Wales and Canberra, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present. If anyone's got any comments or questions, please pop them into the Q&A box, which you can find in your header. And I'm very happy to respond to questions and comments as we progress. So today we're focusing on South Australia. Ignore the headline of the front page. This is the 7th of 8 webinars that I've done, and my apologies about that front cover. I pedal the bike and answer the questions and do the talking, so sometimes things slip through. So what are we going to cover today? First of all, we're going to look at why or how did Labor win? What's different this election? Looking at the Senate and what the shape of that is and how that impacts on what we're doing. Looking ahead in terms of where we might be going as a parliament this term. Federally, how you can engage with the government. And for South Australian organisations approaching engagement, what do we need to think about as South Australian organisations in particular? So background, let's think about what happened in the election. Labor's win was obviously bigger than most people expected, even within the party. A lot of people thought they'd scrape in with a small majority or maybe even end up in a minority government. Now, that didn't happen, obviously. We had a different result than I think many predicted. And there was a couple of reasons for that. I think really fundamentally, people went for something that's sort of a stable option, something that was presenting some answers to the cost of living issues that people were dealing with. The coalition were taking things away rather than giving things to people. They were talking about making large-scale amounts of people redundant or sacking people in the public service. They were talking about removing the right to work from home for the public service. There was sort of, I suppose, a perception in the community that, what's the impact of that going to be on me? You've got to remember that most people don't necessarily engage with politics in quite the way that you and I do in the detail that we do, or they tune in and then they tune out and they tune back in briefly. People are doing their stuff day to day, living their life, doing all different things that they do. And so, the day-to-day nuances and minutiae of politics and, the day in, day out announcements of elections in that detail doesn't necessarily get absorbed by people. So I think when you zoom out a bit during the election, what we saw was a situation where, Labor was presenting a pretty straightforward, simple, focused, quite disciplined set of propositions to the electorate. It was a disciplined election campaign from the government and the Prime Minister. If you conversely compare that to perhaps his performance at the election before, not that his performance was particularly bad or ineffectual, but it was certainly, he was sort of warming up, if you like, and throughout the fact that he's been in government now as Prime Minister for 3 years, and I think has really hit his stride. We saw a very disciplined and focused performance by him and the people around him. So what's different about this election for the first time in history? And this is quite significant, and I do want people to sort of try and understand this. Obviously, Labor has two factions, the left, the more progressive side of the party, and the right, the more socially conservative, if you like, with sort of antecedents in the Catholic sort of the Catholic tradition of the Labor Party in many states. So the Labor's left faction now holds more seats in the Labor caucus than the right. So all the MPs and senators together collectively are called the Labor caucus. And there are also more people from the left in the ministry than there are from the right. Now, this is the first time in 100 and whatever, 50 years or however long the Labor Party has been around. Obviously, the Labor Party's political wing has not looked the same for that period of time. We haven't had, Parliament hasn't looked like it has federally across that whole period of time. But never before has the left had that position. And I would like to just say this is not something that was probably accidental from the Prime Minister's point of view. He used to be the national convener of the left in Parliament. He comes from the left politically, and he was, for example, he was the Labor Party, the left New South Wales Assistant Secretary, and the party used to work for a member of the left in federal Parliament, a guy called Tom Uren, who was his mentor. And so, not that he chose and sort of had a chessboard and had all the pieces on it, but obviously he had a hand in ensuring that there were, where possible, perhaps some left candidates selected for pre-selection. Obviously, they didn't expect to win the amount of seats that they did to some extent. So some of it is happenstance, sorry, and some of it is intentional, but it is an interesting point. Historically, obviously, it's the largest Labor grouping ever in the House of Representatives. And at the same time, we're also looking at the smallest coalition in years, the worst result in over 70 years for the coalition. And I think from the community's point of view, from the electorate's point of view, if they've absorbed anything in the last few weeks since the election, it's probably that the coalition isn't unified. They sort of split and they came back together again a few days later. And, probably didn't run well with the electorate. If they absorbed anything, they sort of knew that there was trouble afoot in the coalition. It's also it's a smaller group. There was some key issues there. We'll get to that in a minute. I think it's more complicated than just the numbers, even though Labor has a very large cohort in the House of Representatives. It's obviously the first preference vote for both major groups, the Coalition and Labor, has dropped significantly compared to historic levels. It's the lowest result for both of them in history. And it's the biggest result for independents. So more people voted for someone other than the main two groupings than any other party. And that's the first time that's ever happened in Australian history. So even though on paper we have a large result from Labor, on the face, there's 94 people in the House of Representatives. It's not I wouldn't want to characterize it. I wouldn't want you to think that it's what I would, people might say it's a landslide. Obviously there are a whole lot of other factors which both of the major groupings are going to have to deal with and look at and process. So how do they deal with the movement to the crossbench and to independents? The independents made many of the counts really complicated. We've seen that. We saw a lot of counts go on for some weeks. We saw some of the most complex or the most complex counts in the AEC's history. They defined it as that. And so, the growth of people supporting and placing their vote somewhere else has continued to increase and will continue to increase in the future. So even though Labor has a large mandate or an increased mandate, it is something they're going to have to be cautious about, because even a reasonably small amount drift away from their baseline numbers will result in a reasonably sized drop in their numbers in the House. So it's complicated, right? And I think people need to understand that. I think the election was more of a rejection of what the coalition was offering rather than as landslide or a full embrace of Labor. So what does the Senate look like? And I think it's really important to understand what the Senate is going to be, how it's going to be shaped. Obviously, Labor has the ability to pass legislation, or has to pass legislation through the Senate, to enact legislation. It needs to pass it in the Senate, and there's two ways to do that, either via the coalition or via the Greens. It's worth noting that in the last parliament, the coalition and Greens had the numbers to come together to block legislation in the Senate. They don't have that ability now, with a Greens senator having defected to the Labor benches, Dorinda Cox from Western Australia. And so for those reasons, it's a more favourable situation for the government. One Nation's got 4 senators, which are the same number as the Nationals. And I think it's going to be interesting to see, once Parliament starts sitting, what that's going to look like in terms of perhaps some of their narrative, and how the media might deal with that, as we have a lot of One Nation senators in the Senate. So what's next? A coalition obviously reunited after Liberal leader Susan Lee and Nationals leader David Littleproud reached a formal agreement. It's worth noting that David Littleproud sort of threw down the gauntlet, wanted to not stick to the cabinet solidarity agreement that had been in place for a long time, and shadow cabinet or cabinet solidarity, which is where the Nationals and the Liberals agreed to vote. The people in the cabinet or shadow cabinet agreed to go into the chambers and vote in the way that they agreed to in the shadow cabinet or the cabinet room. Now, David Littleproud put to Susan Lee that the Nationals be allowed to vote in whatever way they like on legislation. She rejected that, and it came out that what David Littleproud had done was freelance on that. It's something that he hadn't put to or wasn't discussed in the National Party room, which is interesting. There may be some, knock-on effects to David Littleproud's leadership. I dare say that there's going to be trouble afoot. It is interesting that there's 2 former leaders, Michael McCormack and Barnaby Joyce, who are sort of sitting in the naughty quarter. It'll be interesting to see what happens there. The Nationals have secured 6 shadow cabinet roles, 1 less than Littleproud initially sought. And obviously the Liberals had to move ground on some policy issues, but not to quite the position that the Nationals wanted on some of them, such as net zero. That's up for debate. You probably have noticed for some weeks now, both coalition partners have talked about that's going to be the subject to the review. Everything's on the table. It's easy to sort of stand behind that for some period of time. Eventually, they're going to have done the review, and they're going to have to come to some sort of view on these issues, but it hasn't happened yet. I think uncertainty was something certainly that that definitely worked in Labor's favour during the election. They were the stable, voice of people in office, and what was happening all around us was some uncertainty. There was Liberation Day in the United States. There was the Trump-Zelensky meeting in the Oval Office, and things started to get real. People then sort of connected with the election. They sort of wondered whether or not what was going on over there, when they sort of saw their superannuation value dropping, or whatever it is happening to the economy. Just sort of, you've got to remember, sort of people absorb in the way that they absorb it, and so we all absorb information differently. But they didn't want that. They didn't want to buy into that, and there was a strong connection. All the polling has indicated that people connected Peter Dutton to the Trump agenda. Obviously, Peter Dutton was a very effective opposition leader. He was putting forward a very articulate, strong position on sort of the cost of living crisis, and that reflected in the polls. As late as February this year, it looked like the coalition was probably in the box seat to form a minority government. But that didn't happen. That uncertainty continues to happen, and it's continuing to sort of swim, to sort of be all around us. We obviously are seeing some impact on oil prices and petrol prices, which are going to happen because of the challenges of the Middle East conflicts now. And so it'll be interesting to see how that is going to be managed. One of the things that I did pick up this morning was that the oil price won't necessarily have an impact probably won't have an impact on interest rate decisions of the Reserve Bank, not for some time, unless they have unless the Middle East, the Iran-Israel conflict continues for quite a while, and then that may have some impact on inflation over time, but in the short term, probably unlikely to have a huge impact on our economy. We may see some increases to petrol prices at the bowser. One of the things that Labor is definitely trying to do is think about productivity and improving it. Obviously, if you increase productivity, you make the economy more productive, goes without saying, and we get more money basically into the bottom line of the budget. The budget position is improved. We have debts and deficits at the moment in the budget, and obviously the government would like to improve that and make the ledger the best it possibly can do. And so the Treasurer, who's speaking at the press club today, if anyone is interested in tuning in, it'd be really interesting to see what he says about productivity. He's flagged that it's one of the things he's going to address. And in the coming weeks, they're having a industry, government industry unions roundtable in the cabinet room, which will have productivity on the agenda. There's also an inquiry that's being run by the Productivity Commission. One of the things that I think is important, that if you are having conversations with government or government advisors, that you should think about whether or not productivity is something that you can address in something that you are taking to them. So if you're taking a fee-for-service arrangement, or you're in a fee-for-service arrangement with government, and productivity is something that you can think about or address or discuss, then I would encourage you to do that. So what's the outlook? One of the things that I would say is, many of my team will sort of endorse that I was concerned about, not concerned, but I thought anything could happen. The polls were close. There was only one pollster, YouGov, which was sort of saying that Labor looked like they were in a better position. And as I said before, the coalition did look like it was in an election winning position, quite up to at least February. What was really interesting, though, is how the polls really changed very quickly. And we did a whole lot of work with YouGov during the election. We did 3 webinars with them. And one of the things that they made the point of was that the move in polls between February and May, when the election took place, was the biggest change in polling in Australian history. It's very rare that polls move so much, so quickly, and it did in this occasion. I think it probably, in large part, was the result of international turbulence and the perception that what the option was for on the opposition side of the parliament was perhaps going to echo what was happening overseas. I heard just a couple of days ago that Australia is only second to Norway in its opposition to the Trump agenda in terms of research and polling, that it's asking people what they think of it. Obviously, polls are polls, but it's interesting that we are not liking what Donald Trump is selling on a range of levels, both probably politically, economically, in terms of the trade. Other people will have their own individual views on how they pick up on the Trump agenda, but but apparently that is looking like the case. There's not a lot of support for Trump and his agenda here in Australia. Obviously, I think the success of the government in this term will very much depend on domestic performance, perception, and the behaviour of Labor and the Prime Minister. I've been, obviously observing him and his performance over in Calgary at the G7. He's been on the sidelines. He's been invited. He's not at the table as he's not one of the G7 countries, or we're not one of the G7 countries, but he's been there as one of the other leaders that are actively participating, and his performance are very his performances in press conferences are very strong, and you may have sort of picked that up. I think no politician is flawless in these things. He's still pretty salt of the earth. He's pretty down to earth. It's pretty straightforward, but there's a lot less umming and ahhing. There's a lot more clarity. There's a lot more determination and straightforward responses to questions. And he seems in charge of the press conferences when they happen. And they're pretty intimidating when you have 30 or 40 journalists in front of you, hammering you on various things. Got to be across a lot of stuff. And I think if the Prime Minister continues to perform like that during the election, and there's sort of likelihood that seems to be what's happening, and the government doesn't become complacent, I think it's likely that they'll be returned for a third term. Now, election results are never going to be the same. All these new Labor MPs, backbenchers, have one job really, is to go and win their seat again. They're not all going to win. Some of those seats weren't predicted to be a win for Labor. But, there will always be pluses and minuses in an election result, but it is reasonably likely that there will be a third term. What I think is going to be interesting is whether or not we see a transition in leaders between perhaps Prime Minister Albanese and Jim Chalmers. Obviously, it's a bit early to predict that, and there's a lot of things that may happen or may not happen. People often transitions aren't necessarily easy in politics. People don't typically like giving up power, but it's us as observers to watch and them to play out. So one of the things that I think everyone is asking is this government going to be cautious or is it going to be bold? And I do say that I think they could be both, and let me explain what I mean by that. I spoke last week at the Australian Progress Conference in Canberra, where 250 or so not-for-profit and organisation leaders and CEOs gathered to discuss, their agenda for the next year or two or three. And that was a big question in most of the sessions. What's going to happen now that the current government has a pretty reasonable mandate, a sizable majority? I do think that the government will be cautious to some extent. Paul Erickson, and for those of you who have not seen his press club speech of a couple of weeks ago, jump on and have a look at it. It's worth listening to. If you just look up National Press Club on YouTube, you'll find it. It's interesting. He is a member of the left faction. He was handpicked by the Prime Minister for the role. He urged the party in his press club speech to deliver on what it took to the election. And what I mean by that is, people voted for what it said on the label. That's what they expect to get, what it said on the label. That's not to say that they can't do something more than that. And I think the suggestions, the early suggestions and subtle language changes have indicated that there's going to be a bigger, bolder agenda. If you listen to the Prime Minister's speech to the press club last week, and again, if you're on the YouTube channel, go for broke, because there's a whole lot of stuff on there worth listening to. He said just that. He talked about this industry unions government roundtable, which wasn't something, I think it's important to note, it was not something that they brought to the election. So this is new. And people have not, jumped up and down about that. It's okay. We can talk about stuff. We can talk about ideas. Let's get together and think about them. But I think what Paul Erickson is saying is do what you said you were going to do, get people back on track, improve the economy, improve cost of living, and make that happen. But it is possible also to do some other things that perhaps you weren't planning on doing prior election, because I would dare say if you put 100 Labor advisors in a room, most of them would not have predicted this result. And they would have been probably much more cautious about what they may have been able to achieve in this term. They do now have they're in a different position. And so I do think they are probably thinking a little bit further afield, particularly if they're going to be in government for 6 years. It enables them to think long term. And one of the things that the Prime Minister has talked about, both in his press club address last week, and also I would also encourage you to listen to a recent podcast that he did with Nine Media, Paul Sakal, which you can find on any podcast provider. I listen to Spotify, but others do other things. Listen to them on other platforms. He talks about Labor he wants to try and make Labor a natural party of government. Rather than Labor being, in power for 3 years and then sort of, then coalition in government for 9, or, Labor being in government for a few years and then them having 3 prime ministers, 2 of them the same, Kevin Rudd twice and Julia Gillard once, and it's all a little bit it implodes. What he's talking about in those 2 appearances, both the press club and his appearance on the podcast, is about long-term stable government that allows you to create an environment where people see you as a legitimate government, and that Labor is not entitled. Entitled's the wrong word, but is able to occupy the mantle of long-term government with credibility. And by having that strength, it enables you, having that position, and enables you to then move forward and to do things, not just the sort of core agenda that you've committed to people in the election, but perhaps thinking about other things which dovetail in and reflect and work from and are springboarded from that agenda, perhaps, but perhaps go that are bolder and take you in new areas that perhaps you hadn't considered. I think there are also some signs that some ministers are looking to be a little bit bolder in a couple of areas. There's a couple of staffing appointments which have not been public yet, and a couple more. Couple of really interesting, courageous policy statements, which I think is really interesting. So what I would counsel you to do is with the ministers that you deal with, really zone in, really focus on what they've said since the election. Have a look at any radio, any long form print, any speeches that they've made. Now, each minister has a website through their department where all of these transcripts are uploaded pretty much verbatim. So you can see what they've said. You don't have to have access to media monitoring services. It's there for the reading. I'd encourage you to read those just to see whether there's any small or even more significant moves or differences in where they may have been going into the election, or where they thought they needed to be, versus where they think they might be able to start moving to now. And I would encourage you to do that. Catherine's asked, how do you identify a politician's involvement in their party factions? Typically, if you just Google someone and say, what faction is Mark Butler in, or what faction is Tony Burke in, it'll tell you. There's also probably, Labor, if you put in Labor right faction federally, you'll have a list of people that comes up in Wikipedia. It's usually pretty much updated. It's certainly not something that they make public formally, but it's pretty well documented that you can find it that way. I hope that helps. some years ago, there used to be a third faction in Western Australia and South Australia called the centre left, but that has sort of diminished over recent years, and really there is only the right and the left. There's a couple of people who are not in a faction. Andrew Leigh, who's a member of Parliament in Canberra, who's a minister, and a friend of mine, and another MP in Canberra are not factionally aligned, but I think they're the only two. So how do you engage with the government based on, the possibility of a long-term situation with a government that is looking more constructively to a longer period in office? And obviously, if we see Labor transitioning to Jim Chalmers or another leader, then you may even see 4 terms. Who knows? Like in February, I would have predicted a coalition victory. So don't ask me to predict 9 years away, but it is possible. And what I would urge you to do is think about having conversations with the advisors and the government and the ministers and the departments the departments won't talk to you about a long-term agenda. That's it's in the political side of the equation. But what is some of the things that they're wanting to do and achieve? Have those honest and open discussions. I think Labor will initially be cautious, but it will want trusted partners to work with. And I think it's important that you need to try and be that partner and bring data and evidence and a desire for collaboration and bringing information to them. There's nothing wrong with taking a different position and putting forward a counter argument. But I would start with the place where let's start with where we can agree and where we can work together, and then think about the other things that you may have to discuss in a more collaborative way. It would be my advice. Challenge, but do so with evidence that backs your position. Don't have an argument for argument's sake. If you can perhaps start with a more collaborative position, that's not to say, obviously, with your members or with your sector that you may have to take a position that disagrees with some ministers and some policy announcements or some stances, but do so advisedly. One of the other things that I would urge you to do in terms of communication is think way beyond traditional media. It's obviously where a lot of this election was fought, podcasts and influencers and backbench, and also, the backbench social media feeds. There's a lot of possibilities there. There are 64 members of the Labor backbench, 30 in the ministry, 64 backbenchers. That's a lot of people and a lot of social media feeds. And I think there's an opportunity there to perhaps encourage them to, communicate through those channels in whatever way they can that may benefit you or support or leverage from what you're saying. We will be doing a podcast, so we will be doing a webinar about that in the coming weeks. So how do we engage federally? That's a big question, and it's an important one. Obviously, there are some staffing changes underway. Ministers are still reassessing staff roles, particularly if they're looking at a longer term agenda. People are still being engaged. Some staff appointments still have not been confirmed. Most of them have been. Don't assume that your last conversation was exactly where you're going to pick it up from. I think you need to have an honest and open discussion with people about where their thinking is on the thing that you're talking to them about, and ask them that. See where the thinking is. And as I mentioned before, think about and be absolutely acutely aware of subtle or perhaps not so subtle changes in shifts in language and priorities that ministers may be speaking about. Framing your agenda, as I mentioned before, in government terms, that's not what I'm saying there is only be limited to what the government is saying. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is start there Begin there. Where can you align yourself to their agenda? And begin at that point. Yes, be ambitious. Yes, urge them to do other things, but think about where you can align and work together with them as part of what you're going to them with. There's going to be a lot of people with a lot of gaps in knowledge. There's going to be a lot of people who, if you Google them, you're not going to be able to work out what they know or what they think about your issue because they probably don't. So, you need to be able to communicate to them about what you're selling. You need to educate them about what it is you're doing, your issues, what you are delivering, the solutions that you're proposing. And there's a lot of people that you can communicate that to. The 64 Labor backbenchers, I keep on using that figure, but it's a big one. It's huge. And you need to get to know all of them, each and every one of them. And don't dismiss the people who are in the ministry. They are members of parliament too. If they've got a lower house seat, they've got to be re-elected. So they're going to have to be responsible back to their electorate. So if there is an issue that that has local currency, so for example, if you can establish that there are 2,000 undiagnosed people with X or Y in every seat or someone's seat, by using ABS statistics or the data that you have, and take that to people. It's important. It's relevant. It convinces them that something needs to be done. So that's something that you need to think about. And obviously be bandwidth aware. If you were the Prime Minister's office, and I'm not trying to say that we play violins at this moment because it's, they're all hard done by. They choose to be politicians. They choose to be in these jobs. But you've got to think about what they're trying to balance in any day in terms of members of parliament or people in the government. I'm talking about really the ministers. If you're in the Prime Minister's office, 3 days ago, you were trying to evacuate 250 people from Iran and Israel and surrounding areas. That's now gone up to over 1,000 today, 2 days later. So, there's some real, big issues happening. There's a lot of conflicts. There's a lot of stuff happening internationally. There's stuff happening in our region. There's big issues happening every day, every moment of every day. So be really bandwidth aware when you go into people. Everyone that you talk to will have a lot of stuff that they're dealing with, not just the thing that you're going to be talking to them about. Starting with advisors, I think is really important. I was a previous advisor to the Rudd and Gillard and Beazley periods in Parliament and previously worked for the British Labor Party. And so, I would see this, but I do think ministerial advisors can often be more accessible, a bit more honest, a bit more open, a bit more candid than ministers are themselves. Use those sorts of meetings, conversations to gather information, understand what's possible, understand what the thinking is within the government and within the minister's office. Importantly, don't ignore departments. You may or may not have relationships with departments. If you have a fee-for-service arrangement or some sort of funding, you will have departmental contacts to account to. So making sure that you know those people, but trying to establish relationships with people to understand what's possible. They're not going to talk to you about the political agenda. They leave that very squarely within the purview of people on the Hill. But nonetheless, it's important to have those relationships and understand the working. And as I say, I'll say it again, there are 94 Labor MPs in the House, 64 backbenchers. Make sure you get to know them and think about all the different ways that they're going to be participating in Parliament. There'll be inquiries, there'll be committees that they'll sit on. There'll be parliamentary friends group. Many of those are being reconstituted or reformed with new conveners. You'll be able to see those gradually be populated on the APH website. There's a section there, pretty easy to find, of the parliamentary friends groups, which are all there with the conveners. That will all, be populated in the coming weeks. Expect, I'd say, in the next 2 to 3 months, you'll have clarity on the new conveners. As I said before, obviously parliamentary democracy, the cornerstone of a Westminster system is having a robust opposition. It's what we have. And I'm not saying that we don't have an opposition that we don't canvass or don't engage with or the crossbench. It's an important and an imperative part of our democracy. One of the things that I posited at last week's Australian Progress meeting or conference was that we now have such a big Labor team that there is a world in which we don't necessarily have an opposition within Labor. We have a big enough group that you can create an awareness of an issue and perhaps a momentum within the Labor caucus to effectively move an issue reasonably quickly and reasonably effectively when you had a smaller group. You have 94 people in the House, and so I think it's really important to think about that. Engaging Labor-wide is important. And just going back to the crossbench and opposition, I would, in terms of how you engage them, I'd give Labor the opportunity to say no, to say talk to the hand. No, we're not going to do what you're selling. We're not interested. Before you escalate it to the opposition and get them to sort of ask questions in Parliament or ask questions in inquiries. Now, that may only be a couple of months. The first sitting week is in July. You've got a bit of time to get a sense of where Labor may be sitting on issues, but don't rush to have a big argument if you don't have to have one quite yet. I'd give Labor the opportunity to say no and really push the Labor caucus and see where you can push them on your issues and your requests first. Obviously, there's a couple of different dates coming up. There's MyEFO, there's the budget for next year. I'd urge you to continue to start thinking about both of those dates. Budget, I would start socializing some ideas or at least talking to people about ideas. MyEFO is the mid-year economic forecast outlook. That really will be, it's a sort of mini budget. It's a budget halfway through the year. And what it will do is it will put some substance on the commitments that the government of Labor made at the election. And I think that's probably where its focus will be. So really, it's probably for new spending and new ideas and new initiatives. I think it's probably next year's budget that you need to have your focus on. And my very strong recommendation is to start that work now. It's June. Don't think that it's too early. It's not. The budget submission process is not like an ATM. You don't just put in a submission and get the money out in May. It's a lot more complicated than that, and it's a lot more contended. And it's also, we've got debt and deficits that the government's having to handle and manage. They need to have good arguments about making new spending commitments, and so that's your job. There's also sitting and non-sitting weeks that you can look at for engagements. I would say that there's not a lot of openings for events this year. When we've been trying to look at booking events for October, there hasn't been a lot of available. So you may need to get a committee room hired via a politician to hold an event rather than booking it as an external person. So think about all the options there. Obviously, there are non-sitting week meetings, and I would urge you to go and meet people in your area. So in South Australia, who's around? Who can you talk to? Who can you go and meet in person? Get in front of them. So let's think about South Australia. We're coming up to the end of the webinar. If we've got a couple more slides to go on South Australia. If you've got any questions or comments, please pop them in the Q&A box. So obviously there's a strong relationship between South Australia and the federal government. There is, both governments are Labor-led. So I think there are obviously a number of funding opportunities and pipelines and collaborations between the two. As I said before, focus on where the government ministers, where the government MPs are in your area. Make sure that you get to know them. In terms of, so South Australian federal ministers, MPs, and tapping into local connections, depending on what it is you do. Is it something that's very geographically based, or are you running a national organisation, or is it a South Australian based organisation? Depending on what your focus is, really depends on who you need to go and talk to. But if it is a national organisation, or if you're trying to expand into other states, obviously you need to think about going to talk to people in other states as well, and that can be done via an online meeting if that's the easiest way. And most MPs are very happy to do online meetings. Look for South Australian election commitments in terms of, I'm sorry that the light is shining on my face there. Look for South Australian commitments that were made during the election, and really try and zone into those, and try and unpick those. Have they all been allocated? There may have been a sort of an allocation of funding, but the specifics weren't perhaps detailed. What else can you find out about money that's been perhaps announced but not allocated, if that makes any sense? So, a general pool of money may have been announced, but it may not have for a specific area in South Australia, for example, but it may not be detailed who's getting that money. In terms of building relationships, it's really important to engage with both federal and state government representatives. Many areas like health, infrastructure, and education, jurisdictions are shared. It's really important to, I'm sure many of you have great relationships at the South Australian level, but understand where those decision makers are sitting, if they're joint funded proposals, or if there's a possibility for them to consider a jointly funded proposal. There's the South Australian budgets, and the next election is next year in South Australia. So, there's always opportunities to engage in the run-up to that as well. I would urge you to try and get in front of people to understand what's possible in terms of co-designed ideas and initiatives. I think that is always a possibility. So thank you so much for your time today. That ends our webinar today. We will be putting the recording up on our YouTube channel a little bit later on today and sending out the slides. I'm grateful for your time, and thank you so much for joining. Keep posted, keep looking for dates of our new webinars that are coming up. We'll be circulating those, and look forward to seeing you again in the future. Have a great day. Thanks so much.